I'm Peter Coles. For those of you who don't know me, I'm well, I suppose you could still say new Diocesan Secretary. I've actually been here about 7 months now, so beginning to get into the flow and beginning to recognise quite a few faces, so that's good. I want to just give a little bit of time to talk about the size of the pie and also how we allocate the pie, and take you through that. I'm increasingly becoming aware that when we talk about parish share, actually it is those two aspects that get referenced, and actually we often confuse them in the way we talk about them. So actually, as we kick off this review, which ostensibly will actually be looking at how we allocate the pie, we've done some early benchmarking. I say we, actually what I mean is Malcolm Twigger-Ross, our finance director. Malcolm, if you just wave your hand. He's done some excellent work for us to benchmark us with Portsmouth and with Winchester. And I want to share some of the outcome of that with you this morning. Something that I did with Diocesan Synod last Saturday. So actually, you're very privileged. You get to see and hear this quite early on. So our total budgeted costs here in this diocese are just over 12 million. They're actually 12,057,000. Now this is our gross cost base. It differs from the figure that some of you may be familiar with, may have heard of 11.3 million, which is the figure we normally talk about when we talk about budgeting. But that's the 11.3 million actually nets our rental and investment income, which is about 350,000. Our grants from the All Churches Trust, trading income in education, and some contingency. Now that 12 million, as you can see from this slide, breaks down into 4 big chunks. Our spend on stipends, which also includes the pension costs that are associated with those, our spend on housing for clergy, our spend on the national church, that's a contribution to the national church, which we get some of that money coming back. So ministerial training, for instance, we make a contribution and some of that money comes back to pay for that. And then that very big chunk called other, which is often a focus of attention, and we'll talk about that. That's the central diocesan teams, which are actually a combination of ministry support and administrative support. So we'll go into that. Our total cost base at 12.1 million is just slightly larger than Winchester, who are 11.73 million, but almost double that of Portsmouth, who are 6.6 million. However, unlike both Winchester and Portsmouth, we're much more reliant, as we've already heard this morning, on parish share for our income, with 94% of our income coming from a combination of parish share and parochial fees. And actually all our parochial fees income that comes to the diocese goes back into contributing to reducing the parish share cost. The delta with those other dioceses is actually made up of a difference in grants, investments and rental income. So Winchester's at 89%, that combination of parish share and parochial fees, and Portsmouth down at 78%. So you can see they have other areas of income. So much more interesting than the overall income is really how that pie breaks down. And I just want to take you through quite quickly each of those 4 chunks of the pie. And the place to start is the largest part of that pie, which is our stipends. Now actually, our stipends in this diocese are actually higher than they are in actually any other diocese in the country. And that stems back to decisions that were made in 2003 when there was a generosity and sacrifice report. And there was a very clear decision made in this diocese about the level and the policy that we would use for setting stipends. And so that really does reflect how we value our clergy. But the impact of that is that we are actually 8.8% above the national stipend benchmark with our stipends. We're 6.7% above the regional stipend benchmark, and actually 4.1% above any other diocese in the country. And just to contextualise that, if you were to, for instance, level us with the London diocese, stipends in the London diocese, it would reflect about 5% of our parish share. Now, whilst our number of stipendiary clergy at 1.3 clergy per parish is much lower than Portsmouth, they're 1.8 and Winchester 2.1, the number of stipendiary clergy that we have to the Christian population is much higher at about 1 to 5,000 compared to Portsmouth are about 1 to 6,000 and Winchester 1 to 7,000. I think that's something we probably need to delve into a little bit further as we look at this benchmarking stuff going through the review to understand exactly what's going on there and what that might mean. But moving on to housing. Now, we do need to do some more work on the housing benchmarking, but on the face of it, it looks like when we net the rental income of our spend on housing, which is 11.1% of our total cost base, it's less than Winchester spend at 11.6% and less than Portsmouth at 11.9%. Now that difference, when you get down into the numbers, shows up particularly in our staffing spend on housing. So that's Ken Mussell and Sue Mattins when I talk about staffing. Many of you may well know those names. Actually, we spend much less than Winchester. We spend about 0.9%, and Winchester 1.7%, so almost double the spend on supporting their housing with staffing, and Portsmouth are at 1.3%. But our council tax here in this diocese is significantly higher than it is in Winchester and Portsmouth. We spend nearly £500,000 per annum just on council tax. But then our rental income on our parsonages is actually lower than Winchester and just a little bit higher than Portsmouth. Moving on then to our national church contribution, which we've already heard is quite significant. In fact, the reality is it's at least 25% more at 9.5% of our cost base than Winchester at 7.5% and Portsmouth at 6.8%. And about half of that is contributing towards that training for ministry cost that I talked about, to which we get about £1 back for every £1.50 we contribute. So that's an indicator of how we are actually very much a net contributor to the training costs for the Church of England. And in fact, that follows through in each of the other areas of our national church contribution. We are very much a net contributor. So moving on now to that other section. Actually, our other section, which includes the ministry support and administrative support departments at the centre of the in the central teams, we're actually the highest compared to Winchester and Portsmouth. at 23.2%. Winchester's 22.6% and Portsmouth 21.9%. But if you were to back out our communities engagement team, CET, the department that's run by Chris Rich from Guildford, which the others have chosen not to have, we would actually be the lowest compared to the other two. And so this is really a question about where we choose to invest in ministry. And it's certainly true that if we didn't have our CET team, there would be an enormous amount of activity and engagement with many of the organisations in this diocese that actually we would actually really lose out on. I won't go through each area as we haven't got the time, and we do need to do a little bit more analysis, but the headlines are that our spend on education and communications are broadly comparable with Winchester, but just a little bit higher than Portsmouth. Our spend on discipleship, vocations and ministry training at 3.7% is quite a bit higher than Winchester at 2.4%, but less than Portsmouth at 4%. Our parish development and evangelism department, run by Alan Hume, whilst the gross figure for that department at 3.3% is higher than both Winchester and Portsmouth, if you back out our mission and development grant fund, the figures are actually comparable. Our stewardship spend, though, in PDE is actually surprisingly much lower at 0.3% than both Winchester at 0.7% and Portsmouth at 1%. And similarly, actually, our safeguarding spend on safeguarding support effort is actually lower than both Portsmouth and Winchester. Some quite surprising things come out in this benchmarking work. Much of our other central support functions appear to be relatively smaller than the other two dioceses due to reduced spend on administration staff, HR and offices. Although, as you know, we're looking to move and bring together our diocesan offices, and we may well find that actually that office spend will level out and become comparable. Overall, when you add those teams here that directly support ministry to our other ministry costs, it looks, therefore, from the benchmarking that more than 90% of our overall cost base goes to support ministry, with just a little over 9%, I think it actually comes out at 9.2%, towards what one might in business terms normally call true overhead costs, which actually for most businesses 9.2% would be considered to be really quite low, and it is certainly much lower than Winchester and Portsmouth. So, in summary, the overall headlines from that benchmarking work, looking at the size of the pie, is that we spend less on our offices, our HR and central support staff. We spend less on safeguarding and stewardship, but we spend more on stipends, our national church contribution, the investment in the CET department, but we have less rental income supporting our housing costs. But otherwise, on balance, we're pretty comparable to those other two dioceses. Now, of course, there's a couple of things there. You might say, well, are those two dioceses actually representative? Do we need to look a bit further? I think that's a good question. And yes, we probably will look at one or two other dioceses just to see where it compares. But we have an enormous benefit with the role that Malcolm has as finance director across Guildford, Winchester and Portsmouth, that he's able to delve right down into those numbers and understand exactly what is meant by a particular categorisation, and therefore the levelling that's been able to be done across these three dioceses is far greater than we'd probably ever achieve with any other diocese. So I suspect we might go and look at some particular areas and benchmark those to add to this work. It's also true to say that the size of the pie really is a matter of decision. It's a matter of where you place your priorities in terms of ministry. And that's much more linked to strategy than it is to just looking at straight benchmarking. So, on to how we allocate the pie. And it may be that you're sitting there and you're very familiar with our current system. I came in and actually I had to scratch my head quite a bit in order to be able to get to a place where I had an understanding. So this is my way of understanding our parish share allocation system. Our parish share calculation is based principally on two components: direct costs of ministry, which actually is the bulk of the cost, that's incumbent, housing, pension, etc., and shared costs, the contribution to the national church, some of those other costs that I talked about, and support for some parishes who can't afford to pay. The shared costs are allocated principally on the basis of attendance figures. It's the October figures averaged out over 3 years. And although those are weighted by the respective local prosperity factor, the attendance figures are actually the ones that really cause much change within any allocation. You'll find the prosperity factors, most of them are 1 point something. So as a multiplier, they make little difference, really, and they certainly don't change year on year or across 2 or 3 years very much. We then apply some caps and floors. Currently, year-on-year changes in parish share are capped at no more than a 4% increase and no less than a 0% decrease, with an overall protection that no parish share allocation in this diocese will exceed 70% of a particular parish's expenditure. So that's how our system works. It seems complicated when we look at the numbers, but essentially it's quite straightforward with two main elements. But there are some pros and cons with our current system, which get well articulated, and you've probably got your own list as well. But here are some, just as some headlines. On the pro side, in 2015, as we've heard, we recovered 98.4% of the allocated parish share, which is really very, very good. Increases in our parish share over the last 5 years as a total, so this of course might vary because of that share element, one parish to another, but overall, over the last 5 years, our parish share total bill, if you like, has managed to keep below the rate of inflation. And it actually represents, well, in 2013, it represented 41% of our PCC's unrestricted income. And we know that PCC income has actually been growing since 2010. So the affordability overall across the whole diocese, and of course it feels very different parish by parish, actually looks to be something that when you compare with other dioceses actually looks quite good. But on the con side, and a couple of these cons, some may say are pros. 14 parishes were actually unable to pay their full ministry costs and therefore had quite a significant support through the share element through the parish share. And 46 parishes currently receive a discount of more than £1,000, which includes adjustments from the expenditure cap. So actually you can see that the share element really does, actually is quite active. And it's certainly true that small parishes may find that the calculated parish share is an extremely high percentage of their total costs. And for churches that are growing due to the overall decline, some of those growing parishes are finding that they're paying an increasing proportion of shared costs. So as the total numbers go down, their proportion of shared element goes up if they continue to grow. So that really leads us to the parish share review, which I'll just very, very briefly give you some idea as to how it's going to work. There are 3 stages to the review: the evaluation stage, which we've just kicked off, the design phase, which is where we'll be looking at the potential for how things might change, and then implementation. After the first stage of evaluation, we will have a stage gate, a review and decision point, a point where we'll just pause, because we anticipate that at that point, after we've gathered all the information and all the viewpoints, it will be much clearer to us exactly what the issues and challenges are with the current system, and therefore the scale of change required to address them. It's possible that achieving these may be possible through some adjustment to the current system, a change in a cap or a floor, or it may be that we need to do a complete root and branch, bottom-up redesign of the model. This level of change will likely impact the duration and scale of the design and implementation stages, so it's important that we pause and get those right. So how does the overall timetable look like? Well, I can't give the exact timetable of the design and implementation stage, but overall, the evaluation stage we anticipate to run through to June, and to have that conversation about what do the next 2 stages look like at the Bishop's Council in June. And then we'll run a design phase which potentially could run from July 2016 through to February 2017, and then implementation, working out and communication, etc., running in parallel with what is essentially our budget timetable from March through to October. And to help us and guide us through the review, this is your review steering group. Our chair, who you've already met this morning, is Nigel Lewis, the chair of the Diocesan Board of Finance. And then I think we've got a really great representation from the rest of the group, from large churches, small churches, treasurers, lay. Actually, if you actually delve down into the experience of each of these people, you see quite a good mix and balance of experience, both from within the church and outside the church. So I think it's going to be a good team to really support and challenge us through this timetable. And that's really all from me, unless there are any very quick questions. We'll have more time for questions and answers later. In which case, I'll hand over to John Preston, who we're really grateful for taking the time to come and spend with us to give a broader view. Thank you.